Our next group is focused on wildlife innovation and something called the WILD Act, which is probably not what you think. And it was advised by Professor Adrian Hill, so if the group is ready, let's proceed.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kelsey Waddell, and I'll be presenting the final briefing for the Wildlife Innovation and Longevity Driver Act team. So first I'll introduce the WILD Act and then go into our focus, which was invasive species management. I'll explain what this act seeks to change and how our program goal wants to help them get there. Then I'll go into the on-the-ground activities that will change as a result of this act. The WILD Act was introduced in April of this year by a bipartisan group of senators and has been passed without objection in the Senate and has been introduced into subcommittee in the House. The three main goals of the WILD Act are to promote innovative technology, to protect and maintain wildlife species, and to preserve global biodiversity. The WILD Act seeks to do this through 4 provisions. The first 2 of these operate on an international level, while the latter 2 focus specifically on domestic conservation policies. We chose to focus on the amendment to the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, both because it presents a reasonable scope and because we felt we could contribute the most to the program design, as the other 3 provisions are all reauthorizations or already have program designs. The stated goal of the amendment is to protect water, oceans, coasts, and wildlife from invasive species. An invasive species is a non-native species that can cause ecological harm, economic harm, or harm to human health, and they are a worldwide problem. In the United States alone, invasive species cause an estimated $120 billion worth of damage every year, and 42% of animals on the endangered species list were put there at least in part because of invasive species. Because invasive species are such a problem, the government currently does manage them. The secretary of every department that manages federal land and water resources, such as the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Interior, are all members of the National Invasive Species Council. This council provides vision for invasive species management at a national level. However, each of these departments is not required to have an individual management plan for invasive species, and neither is coordination between departments required. Although the National Invasive Species Council does have a nationwide invasive species management plan, compliance with this plan is also not required. This amendment would seek to change that. It would require the secretary of every department to create a department-specific invasive species management plan. Our program design aims to help the secretaries in forming these plans, as well as coordinate management between departments and make a structure of guidance from the National Invasive Species Council using a unifying tool that we've developed called a prioritization framework, which I'll explain in a moment. The goal for the first year of our program design is to create this prioritization framework and at the end of the year disseminate it to the relevant departments so that they can begin to utilize it and form their own invasive species management plans. The structure of the prioritization framework is based on the requirements of the amendment. First, that the ecological costs and economic costs of an invasive species be taken into consideration, and second, that you must evaluate the actual implementation feasibility of the associated management activities. So in analyzing an invasive species, a department would first put it through one metric evaluating its relative ecological costs and a second evaluating its relative economic costs. This would establish an overall level of harm for the species. They would then evaluate both the cost effectiveness and efficacy of the associated management techniques. So, for example, if the Department of Interior is analyzing 2 invasive species, the zebra mussel and purple loosestrife, which is an invasive plant, they'd put both of them through this matrix. It would result that zebra mussels are relatively high in both economic costs and ecological costs, where purple loosestrife is high in ecological costs but relatively low in economic costs. Using this overall level of harm, combined with the evaluation of the implementation feasibility of eradication and management measures, the department could then make an informed decision about the future management of each species. We are tasking the creation and implementation of the framework to the National Invasive Species Council staff. This staff is housed within the Department of Interior, and which manages the largest amount of federal land and water resources. The National Invasive Species Council staff currently has the expertise and to develop this framework, and it aligns with their current priorities, but it currently does not have the capacity to develop and implement this framework. We are therefore proposing 2 new staffing positions. The first is a project manager who would be in charge of overseeing the development of this prioritization framework, and additionally coordinating with the designated liaisons from each department, who would then be in charge of communicating the framework back to their own departments. The second position is a program planning liaison, who would be in charge of overseeing the actual implementation of this amendment throughout agencies within the Department of Interior. And this person would report to the invasive species coordinator, who is in charge of overseeing invasive species management throughout the Department of Interior. There are several milestones that they'll need to accomplish in order to reach the final program goal for the first year. The first is overall goal setting, as well as hiring the staffing positions that I just mentioned. After this, they would start an information gathering period that would culminate in a media report detailing the current invasive species management activities of each department. Using this information, they would draft a framework and provide it to each department for a 1-month feedback period. This feedback would then be incorporated into a final version of the framework. The designated departmental liaisons would be trained in this framework, and then at the end of the year, bring it back to their own departments. The entirety of this first year program design is located within this guidance tier, where they're still developing and creating this framework. Once each department has this framework, they can enter the planning phase, in which they utilize it to craft their own management plans. Once these plans are finalized, they'll enter the implementation phase, where they will actually execute the improved management activities. The amendment also requires that each department form an annual report each year detailing the management activities of the previous year that will then be reported back to the guidance tier, so that the National Invasive Species Council staff can better coordinate between departments. The increase in capacity that this amendment requires will necessitate an increase in budget of $210,000 that they'll utilize alongside $540,000 of leveraged existing staff resources, making the total resource use of the first year $750,000. And it's important to note that the majority of this is person hours and people's efforts in developing and implementing this framework. So the goal of the amendment itself is to change on-the-ground management activities. So we'll look through an example of the Department of Defense. In 2013, the DoD discovered the invasive coconut rhinoceros beetle on its Pearl Harbor Army base in Hawaii. These beetles bore large holes into trees that you can see here, which eventually kill the trees. When the base conducts training operations, the unstable dead trees pose a falling risk to the soldiers, which is unacceptable for the DoD. Their current priority is mitigating this risk to the soldiers, so they cut down any infested trees. Adding an ecological component that would be required by the framework would possibly make one of the priorities of the DoD to actually eradicate this beetle. They could do that using coordinating with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Hawaii, who also have the beetle listed as a priority. They could leverage their combined resources in order to directly eradicate this beetle, which would both ensure soldiers' safety and preserve the palm forest for future use. This is just an example of how this amendment would change on-the-ground management activities at a national level to be better coordinated and more efficient. I'd like to thank my entire workshop team, especially our faculty advisor, Adrian Hill, and I'd like to take any questions.
Great presentation. So when you talk about analyzing the economic cost, does that mean only the cost of eradicating the invasive species, or also the economic cost that having the invasive species could have on on the site?
So the cost of the invasive species is incorporated into the economic metrics of economic costs, and so the evaluation of implementation feasibility is more how much it would cost to directly manage this species and actually execute the management plan.